and Santa Fe. Stick-up in progress. Shots fired. Also report of a officer down. Suspect, white male, medium height, blue jacket, possible facial hair. Last seen running south towards the railroad track. Suspect is considered armed and dangerous. Use extreme caution. 424, the report will be yours. Cruiser 410 covered. DGH is sent.
Did you pick up on who was down?
No, but 131 answered the call, so it's probably either... Look over there. I think that might be him.
It looks like him. You go cut him. I'm getting off.
Okay, I'll go around.
Halt! Police! Hey, you! Hey, halt! Stop, police! Stop or I'll shoot! Hey!
You! Stop! Police! Hold it right there! Stop! Halt!
This nightmarish scenario is based on an actual exercise given in classes used to train police officers in shoot-no-shoot decision-making. Almost every officer who's ever been subjected to this exercise shoots the suspect. And given the situation as just presented, the shooting would probably be justified by an inquiry. But had it been real life, an innocent person would be dead, and the officers' lives traumatized both by the events and the media, who would publicly analyze and reanalyze the steps taken. And in truth, it should not have happened. It may come as a surprise to you, but people with hearing impairments are generally terrified of the police. They've learned that people who appear to be uncooperative are frequently handcuffed. Now, that may be sound policy to the police officer, who can always apologize later, but must first look to his or her own safety. But to someone with a hearing or speech impairment, being cuffed just destroyed any means they have of communication. And their continued silence, or their efforts to avoid having this means of communication stifled, may only serve to excite the officers further. Not a very pleasant situation to be in.
Over the last 17 years, federal regulations have been enacted for dealing with all handicapped people, including the deaf and hard of hearing. These regulations, and a Department of Justice analysis of them, spelled out the legal obligations of law enforcement agencies to render themselves communicationally accessible to deaf persons. This program will take a look at what those regulations mean for law enforcement officers. We'll also illustrate why this is so important and how to better deal with hearing impaired citizens. This is not as unusual a problem as you might think. In fact, persons with hearing impairments form the largest disabled population in the U.S. Deaf people using sign language form the fourth most common language group in America. Obviously, in your duties as a police officer, your chances of having to deal with someone covered by these regulations are actually quite good. Just what is meant by the terms deaf and hearing impaired, or hard of hearing? It's important to note that these terms are emotionally loaded, especially for the deaf and hearing impaired people. They've developed fairly specialized meanings for them, which are as much cultural and sociological as they are technical. But for purposes of this program, we'll stick to the common perceptions of the words. In that sense, hearing impaired or hard of hearing really only means that the individual cannot hear normally. But that is still important for the police officer, because it means that instructions or requests may not be clearly heard or understood, and that someone who would be willing to cooperate simply cannot understand what you want, or for that matter, that you want anything. It's also important because their ability to hear certain pitches or intensities of noise may lead you to believe they can hear normally, when in fact they cannot. If the individual is completely deaf, it means they receive no recognizable auditory stimulus at all. They wouldn't hear your siren from a few paces, much less your voice. You could fire your sidearm right behind them, and although they might feel the heat and concussion, they would not hear the report. So because both deaf and hard of hearing individuals are covered by the federal regulations, unless it's an important technical distinction for this tape, we will simply refer to all classes of hearing impaired people as deaf throughout the tape.
It's important then that you be able to recognize persons who are deaf, and in normal situations, it is not always easy. The first indication may be that they seem to ignore you, or for example, keep on walking when you tell them to stop. And for those individuals with a newly developed hearing problem who are maybe embarrassed or frustrated about it, well, they can become very defensive, even denying there is a problem, and then appear to be really uncooperative when they fail to respond to you. Now, unfortunately, this behavior may not at first be noticeably different than that of someone on certain drugs, or maybe someone just being belligerent. Sometimes you may have noticed their failure to respond to other audible signals. But as we just noted, this is not a sure sign, as some hard of hearing people can still hear certain noises. A good indication is if you see them signing to someone else. Also, upon entering a home, look for some of the telltale signs of hearing impairment, such as lights to indicate when the phone or the doorbell is ringing. A decoder TDD on the phone is a good indication, as are closed captioning on the TV or magazines and literature for the deaf. When a deaf individual realizes that you wish to speak with them, they may use signs, gestures, some speech, or even resort to paper to try to write. If they can lip read, you will notice them watching you intently, especially your mouth. If you think you're dealing with someone who has a hearing impairment, there are several things you can do to quickly ascertain this. And if they do have a hearing problem, to calm them and to proceed more effectively. See, deaf persons are just like everyone else. In a tension-filled emergency situation, they get flustered too. And severe personal tragedy and loss renders them as physiologically and emotionally stunned as the rest of us. And their inability to communicate may only make their frustration and anxiety worse.
Imagine yourself witnessing a catastrophic event requiring immediate action, but not being able to make anyone understand what you're trying to say. And not being able to understand the input from those around you is not very calming in such situations. Added to their natural apprehension about law enforcement officers, the upset of a dramatic situation can make a deaf person seem very nervous indeed.
It's okay.
If the subject has a profound hearing problem, they will probably be able to sign. As we'll see later, there are various sign languages commonly used. But users of either can recognize if a person is trying to communicate with them by signing, even if you're not using all of the proper signs. It would be unreasonable to expect every law enforcement officer to become fluent in the use of sign language. But there are a few simple common signs that you should learn. These signs will allow you to quickly determine if the subject is deaf, and if so, to calm them down and perhaps deal with any emergency problems until help or a qualified interpreter arrives.
Hi, my name is Terry, and I'm here today to teach you a few words and signs when you're dealing with hearing impaired or deaf people. The first most important thing you'll need to remember is your facial expression. To a deaf or hearing impaired person, your facial expression equals tone of voice. If you're telling them to calm down at the same time having an angry expression on your face, this can be very confusing and frightening to the deaf person. So remember, tone of voice equals facial expression. The first word I'm going to teach you the sign for today is stop. Stop. Your right hand comes downward and then is stopped by your left hand. Stop. 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 The next word, wait. Your hands are outward, palms up, and your fingers can wiggle a little bit. If you circle it, it means it might be a long wait. 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 The next one, are you deaf? Here, facial expression is very important. Your eyebrows need to be up, indicating a question, and then the sign for deaf. This is from the old sign for deaf-mute, where the finger was on the lips, and then you pointed to the ear, but now it's been modified along the jawline. Deaf, deaf. The next one, yes. The hand goes up and down like a head nodding. Yes. 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 You can also nod your head and this will indicate yes. No. This is from the manual alphabet, the letter N and the letter O. But it's been sped up. No. 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 And you can also shake your head to indicate no. Next, we have calm down. This seems to be a universal sign because I've seen several hearing impaired people use this. Calm down. Calm down. Calm down. Calm down. Next, I'll get an interpreter. Probably one of the most important phrases you'll need to know because as soon as you start to sign, the hearing impaired person will assume that you know sign language and will start talking to you. So I'll get an interpreter. I, pointing to yourself, will get, your hands like you're getting something, an interpreter. I will get an interpreter. I will get an interpreter. I will get an interpreter. Next one. Are you hurt? Again, the eyebrows should be raised, indicating a question, and the fingers, the index fingers, twist slightly and point inward. Are you hurt? Are you hurt? Are you hurt? Are you hurt? Next, you might ask them where. The index finger is upward and it shakes slightly. If you're asking them where you're hurt, you can add this on to the end of the are you hurt question. Where? 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 In some parts of the country, you might see a deaf person signing where. 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 Medical help is coming. From the manual alphabet, you'll use the letter M on your wrist like you're taking a pulse. Medical help is coming. Medical help is coming. Medical help is coming. Medical help is coming. Next, license. If you're asking them to show you their license, or if you're asking them if they have a license, you can raise your eyebrows, and then it's the letter L's from the manual alphabet, and the thumbs touch slightly. License. 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 Stand there if you need to ask the deaf or hearing impaired person to stand in a particular place. Stand, and then you indicate where you would like them to stand. Stand there. Stand there. Stand there. Stand there. Next, sit there. Again, the same hand shape, only sitting. Sit there. Sit there. Sit there. Sit there. The last one, I do not sign. Again, as soon as you start signing to the deaf person, they will automatically assume that you know sign language. So this might be one of the first things or second things you say to them. I don't sign. I don't sign. I don't sign. I don't sign. Thank you very much for your time today. If you have any questions, I'm sure you can contact any agency near you that teaches sign language class. Thank you.
Use this tape and practice these signs. Like any language, proficiency comes only with practice. You might find that some skill in signing has an application to your own work. And being able to communicate silently from any distance might have some very real advantages.
Once it's determined that the subject is hearing impaired, then certain legal rights for them and obligations for you arise automatically. Let's be clear on this. All law enforcement agencies on both the state and local levels which receive any federal funds now have a federal mandate to ensure adequate and appropriate communication to deaf persons who have a need to or are asked to communicate with these agencies. Now, law enforcement agencies are required by Department of Justice regulations to provide qualified sign language interpreters for communication with hearing impaired persons who rely on sign language. And in Colorado, those laws are even more strict.
All hearing impaired persons must be informed of the law enforcement agency's obligation to have a free, qualified interpreter present during all communications and questioning. This information can usually be safely presented by means of a printed card shown before the arrival of the interpreter. Further, it's the responsibility of the law enforcement agency to determine whether the hearing impaired person uses American Sign Language, or ASL, or Signed English, or even some other form of sign language to communicate. And this is not just for arrestees. The Department of Justice's own analysis of the regulations makes it clear that the provision of interpreter services should also be provided for victims and complainants. Fortunately, that responsibility can be alleviated by simply getting in touch with the state or local interpreter referral agency or Center on Deafness, which will then send the correct certified interpreter.
We'll talk more about that later, but to understand why this is important, this is a good point to explain the distinction between the two signing forms.
American Sign Language is a language completely distinct from English, with grammar and syntax more like Chinese or even French than English. Being a conceptual language, it really does not transliterate directly or accurately into English, but it is the native language of most Americans who are deaf. Signed English is a rendering of ASL signs into English syntax and grammar. Although it may seem that they are therefore interchangeable, a deaf person who uses ASL, which in America is the vast majority, may not be able to communicate fully or successfully in written or signed English. The reason this could be a problem is that some interpreters who are not hearing impaired themselves are only competent in signed English. Just because someone can sign a little does not mean they can properly interpret for police-related issues.
Vera, you have a friend that's deaf, don't you?
Yeah, I do.
You speak a little sign language. Maybe you can help us talk to
not
this
much.
guy.
Well, I'll try.
Okay. Okay, Vera, would you ask him what happened for me, please?
Yesterday, there was a car, police. I said, deaf. I don't understand what he's saying. I think we have a problem. I think you need to call the Center on Deafness to get a qualified interpreter.
Okay, well, you know, they passed out some cards last week. I've got it right here. I'll just call him and we'll see what we can get done here.
If an interpreter is not achieving adequate communication in the eyes of the deaf person, the law enforcement official, or the interpreters themselves, another interpreter must be secured who is qualified to interpret for that individual. To save yourself the problem of finding proper interpreters on your own while still being assured of securing qualified interpreters, a law enforcement agency needs to contact the local or state Center on Deafness or Interpreters Referral Agency where they can obtain a list of certified and qualified interpreters. Someone within the department must be charged with obtaining this number and making it available to dispatchers and officers who may need to conduct interviews. This obligation can become even more critical if the hearing impaired subject is arrested or held for questioning. Now the federal statutes intertwine with constitutional issues. The Miranda rights are still critical when dealing with the deaf. In fact, it may be even more important that you make sure these rights are clearly understood by the subject. You must ascertain absolutely that these rights were broken down to the defendant's language skill level and that they clearly stated their understanding of them. Courts can and have suppressed evidence obtained from a hearing impaired defendant where it was found that the constitutional rights warning was not adequately communicated to the defendant. This has happened even where the rights were presented to them in sign language, but it was later demonstrated that these rights were not broken down to the level of the defendant's ability to understand.
Mike, there's a lady from the Center on Deafness that you called for.
Great.
Hello, my name is Norma Blank. I'm the certified interpreter from the Center on Deafness.
Great. We need to ask this gentleman some questions. Maybe I could get you to sit right here and interpret for me. Would you ask him what happened yesterday for me?
Officer, if you could just ask the question directly to the person, I'll be happy to interpret that.
Great, okay. Can you tell me what happened yesterday?
Well, yesterday there was an automobile accident in town, and I ran over to the police officer to try and explain what happened. And I didn't have any paper.
I tell you what, I need to have some specific questions answered kind of chronologically.
Even simple statements or questions can almost always be taken in several ways. We generally decide on how to interpret the statement or question based on how the other person acts, their expression, the calmness or forcefulness of the delivery, etc. It's the same with the deaf person. Signing is not just a set of emotionally flat hand signals. It involves a whole body language. Lacking variations in volume or vocal inflections, signing becomes very dramatic, very theatrical in its presentation. People using sign language also need these nonverbal clues to properly comprehend what you're asking or saying to them.
So I'll ask him and you can interpret?
That's fine.
Okay. Can you tell me what time this happened?
It was yesterday. The accident was downtown. And, I think it was about 10 o'clock.
Okay, and can you get its specific location?
I think it was at 16th and Glenarm.
And can you ask him which direction were you going?
I was going west.
And watch them as they answer. Even without the use of verbal speech, their emotional state and the emphasis on certain portions of the communication will give you the same insight it does when a hearing person is responding to you.
And, but the policeman pushed me away and I backed off.
Dealing with the deaf and hard of hearing need not be overly difficult for either you or the deaf individual. But with the federal regulations in effect, the burden is clearly on you, the law enforcement officer, to make sure the individual's rights are respected and to do whatever is necessary to effect adequate communications. Now, adhering to the federal regulations is now mandated. But don't feel this is just another bureaucratic burden you must bear. Learning to look closely for signs of hearing impairment and learning the few simple signs we've shown you to calm the subject and open an avenue of communication will yield great benefits on both sides of the badge. And the burden is really incredibly simple to solve. The simple solution to all of the problems, both for your need to communicate and to solve any federal or evidentiary problems, can be found by doing one thing. Get an interpreter. In addition to staving off problems both on the spot and later in court, this extra effort can pay big dividends. Deaf individuals frequently have compensated for their lack of hearing by developing other senses and coping mechanisms. Many deaf people who must rely almost totally on visual communication are extraordinarily observant and can make telling and important witnesses. If only you can communicate with them.